January 17, 1940. The sun had not fully risen over the North Sea. The sky was cold and gray, heavy with clouds that looked like they could swallow aircraft whole. At RAF Wick, a small airfield on the northern edge of Scotland, the wind cut through jackets and gloves like knives. Ground crew moved fast, not because they were eager, but because standing still meant freezing. Parked on the runway was an aircraft most pilots hated. The Bristol Blenheim. It was slow. It was poorly armed. It had almost no armor. Pilots had a name for it. They didn't say it loudly. They said it quietly, usually at night. They called it the flying Coffin. Against modern German aircraft, the Blenheim was outmatched in every way. Faster enemy fighters, heavier guns, better protection. The math was simple and cruel. If a Blenheim met the Luftwaffe in open sky, the Blenheim usually lost. That morning, one Blenheim was being prepared for takeoff. Inside the cockpit sat Squadron Leader Carey. He was not famous. He was not a legend. He was not flying a special mission. This was supposed to be routine. Radar stations had detected enemy aircraft approaching from the east. Numbers unclear. Mission unclear. Orders were short and familiar. Investigate. Report. Engage if possible. Those last two words mattered, if possible. Carey knew exactly what they meant. If the situation was bad, he was expected to turn away. No one would blame him. No one expected a Blenheim to fight superior enemy aircraft alone. Carey ran through his checklist. Calm hands, normal breathing, no dramatic speeches, just another cold morning and another flight into uncertain skies. The engines roared to life. The Blenheim rolled down the runway and lifted into the gray sky, disappearing into low cloud. Minutes later, high above the North Sea, Carey broke through the cloud layer. And then he saw them. Not 10 aircraft. Not a small patrol. An entire formation. German bombers filled the sky in front of him, row after row, stretching across his vision. Heinkel He-111s flying in tight formation, bristling with machine guns. 30 bombers moving with confidence, heading toward the Scottish coast. 30. Carey stared at them for a moment longer than normal, not because he was frozen with fear, but because his brain was trying to understand what he was seeing. This was not something one aircraft was meant to face. Behind him there was nothing. No RAF squadron, no Hurricanes, no Spitfires, just one Blenheim. Carey keyed his radio and reported the contact. His voice was steady, professional. He gave the bearing, the altitude, the number. 30 enemy bombers. Standard procedure was clear. Shadow them, stay alive. Do not engage. Carey could have turned away. No one would have questioned it. The Blenheim was not built for this. Engaging 30 bombers alone was not bravery. It was supposed to be suicide. For a brief moment, the Blenheim hung in the air between two choices: turn back or attack. Carey pushed the throttle forward. The engine strained as the aircraft accelerated. Instead of turning away, the Blenheim's nose pointed directly at the heart of the German formation. Inside those bombers, German crews expected little resistance. Maybe a single British fighter that would fire a few rounds and retreat. Maybe nothing at all. What they did not expect was one outdated British aircraft flying straight toward them, fast, aggressive, and refusing to turn away. In that moment, logic said the Blenheim should die. Instead, it attacked. And within minutes, 30 German bombers would find themselves scattered, confused, and abandoning their mission. Not because of squadrons, not because of overwhelming firepower, but because one pilot in a flying Coffin refused to move aside. To understand why pilots feared the Bristol Blenheim, you have to forget the legend for a moment and look at the reality. When the Blenheim first flew in the mid-1930s, it was considered impressive. At the time, it was faster than many fighters. It looked modern. It represented hope. British newspapers praised it as a symbol of progress, proof that the Royal Air Force was keeping pace with the world. But aviation moves fast in wartime. By the time the Second World War began, The Blenheim had already fallen behind. Aircraft design had changed rapidly, and what once seemed advanced now looked dangerously outdated. The Blenheim was never meant to fight modern enemy aircraft. It was designed as a light bomber. Turning it into a fighter was not a plan, it was a desperate compromise. Speed was the first problem. The Blenheim's top speed was around 280 miles per hour. On paper, that did not sound terrible. In reality, it was a death sentence. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 could fly much faster. That meant they controlled the fight. They could choose when to attack, when to disengage, and from what angle. A slower aircraft cannot escape a faster one. Once spotted, the Blenheim had nowhere to run. Then there was its size. The Blenheim was large and bulky compared to single-seat fighters. It had a wide wingspan and a thick fuselage, built to carry bombs and crew, not to dodge bullets. In combat, size matters. A bigger aircraft is easier to see, easier to track, and easier to hit. German pilots described aircraft like the Blenheim as comfortable targets. It was not an insult. It was an observation. Firepower made the situation worse. Most Blenheims carried only a few, 303 machine guns, one forward-firing gun for the pilot and one in a rear turret for defense. That was it. Against German bombers with multiple defensive guns, or fighters armed with cannons, this was not enough. The pilot had to aim carefully and get very close. Armor was almost non-existent. The Blenheim had no real protection for its crew, no armored seat, no bulletproof windscreen, no self-sealing fuel tanks in early versions. German rounds could punch through the fabric-covered fuselage as if it were paper. A single burst in the wrong place could wound a pilot, kill a gunner, or ignite fuel. Many Blenheims did not explode dramatically. They simply caught fire and fell. This is where the nickname came from. Pilots began calling it the flying coffin, not because they lacked courage, but because they understood probability. They knew the aircraft would not forgive mistakes. They knew that being hit once was often enough. They also knew that if enemy fighters appeared, survival depended more on luck than skill. The cockpit itself added to the fear. The Blenheim's crew sat close together in a cramped space, surrounded by thin metal and fabric. The noise of the engines was constant. Visibility was limited. In combat, the pilot had to manage navigation, flying, and firing with little assistance. The rear gunner, exposed and vulnerable, was often the first to be hit. Many crews watched helplessly as a friend behind them was wounded or killed, knowing there was nothing they could do. Climbing ability was another weakness. The Blenheim struggled to gain altitude quickly. German fighters loved altitude because it gave them energy and control. They could dive onto a Blenheim from above, fire, and climb away before the British aircraft could respond. This vertical disadvantage meant Blenheim crews often entered combat already at a tactical loss. And yet, despite all this, the RAF kept using it. Why? Because there was nothing else. Britain entered the war unprepared for the kind of air combat it was about to face. Hurricanes and Spitfires existed, but not in enough numbers and not everywhere. In northern sectors and coastal patrol zones, Blenheims filled the gap. They were available, they could fly long distances, and they could carry radar or observers. So they were sent up again and again. Pilots knew the truth. They joked about it to cope. Dark humor filled mess halls. Letters home were careful, vague, and often dishonest. New pilots were warned quietly by older ones, don't try to. But war does not respect doctrine. Enemy aircraft do not always appear where you expect. Weather changes. Formations cross paths. Orders arrive late. And sometimes a Blenheim pilot would find himself staring at the enemy with no clear way out. That is why fear followed the aircraft. Not panic. Fear. The calm, professional fear of men who understood risk and accepted it anyway. They climbed into an aircraft they knew was inadequate, fastened their harnesses, and took off because someone had to. Not because they believed the Blenheim was good enough, but because Britain needed eyes in the sky. Losses proved them right. Blenheim squadrons suffered heavy casualties, especially early in the war. Some missions ended with more aircraft lost than results achieved. Crews vanished over the sea. Wreckage washed ashore days later. Others were never found at all. Each loss reinforced the reputation of the aircraft and deepened the dread surrounding it. And yet there is another side to this story, because the Blenheim's weaknesses also shaped the men who flew it. They learned to think differently, to avoid predictable moves, to rely on surprise rather than strength, to strike and disappear, to use clouds, sun, and timing instead of brute force. Flying a death trap forced creativity. It rewarded aggression used carefully, not blindly. The Blenheim punished hesitation. If you flew it passively, you died. If you waited for perfect conditions, you died. If you trusted the aircraft to protect you, you died. Survival required decisiveness. That is what made Carey's encounter so shocking. Not just that he attacked, but that he did so in an aircraft everyone believed could not survive such a fight. The Blenheim was a death trap because it offered no margin for error. It demanded total commitment from its crew, and that is why the Blenheim story matters. It represents the brutal reality of early war Britain, flying outdated machines into a modern war, trusting human skill to compensate for mechanical weakness. The aircraft was never good enough. The men simply had to be. That is why they feared it. That is why they respected it. And that is why, even today, the name Bristol Blenheim carries a quiet weight among those who know what it truly was. A machine that offered little mercy, a cockpit where mistakes were final, a flying coffin that demanded courage every single time it left the ground. Before that morning over the North Sea turned him into a story people would repeat for decades, Carey was just another RAF officer doing his job. No newspaper headlines. No special nickname, no reputation as a daredevil. He was not the kind of man people pointed at and said, "That one will be a legend." Carey was a professional. By early 1940, he had already spent years inside cockpits. He had trained in peacetime, learned to fly when aviation still felt experimental and dangerous, even without an enemy shooting back. He understood aircraft not as symbols but as machines, machines with limits, flaws, and moods. He knew what they could do and, more importantly, what they could not. That understanding mattered. Carey was not reckless. He did not chase glory. Pilots like that rarely survived long. Instead, he belonged to a quieter category, men who stayed alive because they respected risk. He followed procedures. He flew clean. He planned ahead. He did not waste fuel or ammunition. And when situations turned bad, he usually found a way. As a squadron leader, responsibility weighed on him every time he flew. He was not alone in the aircraft. Behind him sat crewmen who trusted his judgment with their lives. Below him were ground crews who would have to clean up the wreckage if he failed. Above him were commanders who expected results without unnecessary losses. Carey understood that balance. Mission versus survival, aggression versus discipline. Most days, survival won. He had seen what happened when pilots pushed outdated aircraft too far. He had attended briefings where losses were reported in flat, emotionless tones. He had watched empty chairs appear in mess halls and stay empty. He knew the price of mistakes, and he knew the Blenheim did not forgive them. That is why his calm stood out. Carey did not swagger. He did not brag. When he spoke precisely. When he flew deliberately. Other pilots trusted him because he did not exaggerate and did not panic. In early 1940, that kind of steady presence mattered more than bold speeches. The war itself was still uncertain. Britain had declared war, but the real storm had not yet broken. This period would later be called the Phony War, but it did not feel phony to the men flying patrols over cold water and hostile skies. Every mission carried the possibility that today would be the day the war truly began. Carey felt that tension like everyone else. He knew Britain was not ready. Aircraft numbers were limited. Radar was improving, but coverage was imperfect. Fighter squadrons were stretched thin. In many sectors, Blenheims filled roles they were never meant to fill because there was no alternative. Carey did not like that reality, but he accepted it. That acceptance defined him. He did not waste time complaining about equipment. Complaints did not stop bullets. Instead, he learned how to get the most out of what he had. He studied enemy behavior. He paid attention to how German crews reacted under pressure. He thought in terms of angles, timing, and psychology. That belief shaped how he flew. He avoided predictable paths. He varied his approaches. He understood that fear worked both ways, that even well-armed enemy crews could make mistakes if surprised or pressured. Carey did not believe in impossible odds. He believed in bad situations and better choices. Still, even with all that experience, nothing prepared him for what he saw that morning. When Carey lifted off from RAF Wick, he expected a patrol, maybe a small enemy group, maybe reconnaissance aircraft. He did not expect to face an entire bomber formation alone. And when he saw them, his reaction was not cinematic. There was no dramatic pause, no shouted words over the intercom, no heroic declaration. There was calculation. Carey understood instantly what he was up against. He knew the numbers. He knew the Blenheim's weaknesses. He knew that engaging could mean death for all 3 men in his aircraft. But he also understood something else. He understood time. Those bombers were heading somewhere. They had a schedule, a route, a purpose. And every minute they were delayed or disrupted mattered. Carey knew he did not have to destroy them. He did not even have to damage them heavily. He only had to interfere. That was a professional's thinking, not a hero's fantasy. Carey was not trying to win a medal. He was trying to buy time, create confusion, and force decisions. If he could make the enemy hesitate, break formation, or lose confidence, the mission might fail even if he did not survive. That is the kind of calculation experienced officers make when the situation turns bad. Carey trusted his ability to fly aggressively without losing control. He trusted his understanding of enemy behavior. And he trusted his crew to do their jobs under pressure. What he did not trust was the idea that doing nothing was safer. For Carey, turning away and letting 30 bombers proceed unchallenged was not neutral. It was a decision with consequences on the ground. That is why his choice matters. It was not made by a reckless man seeking death. It was made by a controlled professional who understood risk and accepted it anyway. After the engagement, Carey did not celebrate. When he landed, he did not climb out of the cockpit smiling. He did not exaggerate his actions. His report was short and factual. He described what happened without drama, focusing on timings, headings, and reactions. He treated the engagement like a problem he had solved, not a miracle he had survived. That reaction tells you who he was. Even later in life, when others called his action heroic, Carey resisted that label. He insisted he had simply done his duty. He emphasized that any trained pilot might have done the same under similar circumstances. Whether that was true or not mattered less than the mindset behind the statement. Carey did not see himself as special. He saw himself as responsible. And that is why his story endures. Because the most dangerous actions in war are not always performed by men chasing glory. They are often performed by calm professionals who recognize a bad situation and choose to act anyway, not because they believe they will win, but because doing nothing feels worse. Carey was not born a legend. He became one in a moment when experience, responsibility, and decision collided. Not because he ignored the danger, but because he understood it and flew straight into it anyway. The alarm bell rang across RAF Wick like a sudden thunderclap. Cold metal echoed in the airfield as mechanics and ground crews moved quickly, boots crunching on frost-covered tarmac. Dawn had not yet broken. The sky was a uniform gray, heavy with low clouds, hiding everything beyond a few hundred meters. The cold cut through clothing like a blade, and the men knew the first few minutes. Scramble, scramble, scramble. The officer shouted, voice hoarse but firm. It was a word that carried weight, a word that meant death or glory, chance or certainty. Every pilot and crew knew its meaning instinctively. Engines had to start. Aircraft had to leave the ground. Every second counted. Carey was already at his Blenheim. The aircraft sat in silence, wings trembling slightly in the icy wind. Its twin engines were quiet now, but soon they would roar, a sound that made the blood pulse faster in a pilot's veins. Carey's hands moved deliberately over the cockpit, checking instruments and switches with calm precision. The pre-flight checklist was routine, almost mechanical, but he knew routine could not save a pilot once the enemy appeared. Only skill, focus, and timing would. Throttle set, instruments green. He muttered to his observer and wireless operator. They nodded, eyes sharp, bodies tense. They had flown together enough to understand what silence meant. Fear, anticipation, and total focus. Outside, mechanics pushed fuel carts and loaded ammunition. Cold smoke curled from engines being started elsewhere on the field. Aircraft of different sizes and colors began their own routines, engines warming, radios crackling, pilots strapping in. The airfield was a hive of energy, but one tension ran through all: the unknown. Radar reports had detected enemy aircraft approaching from the east. Details were scarce, numbers unclear, types uncertain. That uncertainty was part of the terror. Pilots had faced it many times before. They trained for it, but training was never the same as facing reality in the air. Carey pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared to life, a deep vibration that shook the fuselage and cockpit floor. The Blenheim's wings shivered as power surged through them. Carey felt the familiar resistance, the balance of control and danger. He eased the aircraft forward, tires crunching over frost and gravel, the tail lifting slightly as the nose tipped upward. "Clear the runway," shouted a ground crewman. Carey gave a short nod, eyes fixed on the gray horizon. Each second mattered. Engines were warming, instruments were green, and every movement of the control column counted. One mistake here would mean stalling, crashing, or being caught by enemy fighters before the aircraft even left the ground. The airfield was a flurry of motion. Other Blenheims and Hurricanes lined up behind Carey, ready to follow. Pilots adjusted helmets, checked oxygen masks, and tightened harnesses. There was no conversation now, only purposeful movement. Every man understood that the scramble was a race against time, against the enemy, and against fate itself. Carey advanced the throttle fully. The Blenheim lurched forward, fabric wings trembling as it accelerated. Frost sparkled beneath the wheels, vanishing as the aircraft gained speed. The noise of engines became a roar, muffled only slightly by the cockpit wall. At the far end of the runway, the horizon was still gray, indistinct, almost featureless. Carey's hands tightened on the controls. He eased back on the stick, feeling the tail rise and the wheels leave the ground. The aircraft lifted into the freezing dawn, engines screaming, wings cutting through mist and cloud. He had left the ground, but danger was already above. The climb was deliberate. The Blenheim was slow, its twin engines straining to lift the aircraft efficiently. Carey kept a steady hand on the throttle, balancing speed and climb rate. Any overcorrection could stall the aircraft. Any hesitation could cost him seconds that might mean the difference between life and death. Behind him, other Blenheims scrambled as well, engines roaring to life, climbing into the sky in staggered formations. The sound of multiple aircraft created a symphony of power and tension, a choir of machines rushing to confront an unknown enemy. The air above RAF Wick was suddenly alive, full of motion and imminent peril. The radar had indicated 30 enemy aircraft, a number that caused instinctive fear in every pilot. Carey kept that thought at the back of his mind. Concentrate on flying first, observing second, fighting last. The principle was drilled into every pilot: survive long enough to engage with precision, and never underestimate the enemy. Clouds hung low. Carey used them as cover, climbing in patches of mist to obscure his position. Visibility was poor, but that was an advantage. The Germans might be approaching, but he had the element of surprise. The morning was still, almost eerie, with frost rising from the ground like faint smoke. Air traffic from other squadrons began to take shape. Hurricanes screamed past in controlled chaos, their speed a reminder of the Blenheim's limitations. Carey observed their paths, noting angles of approach, altitude, and formation gaps. In his mind, he mapped a route that would maximize his chances, exploiting shadows and cloud cover to reach the enemy without exposing himself to concentrated fire. The tension mounted as reports came in over the radio. German bombers were sighted at high altitude heading toward the coast. Carey adjusted his course, checking instruments and fuel levels, calculating climb rate versus interception point. Time was critical. If the bombers reached the coast unimpeded, lives would be lost below. Then, through the gray haze, he saw them. Tiny shapes at first, dots against the clouds, moving in rigid, disciplined formation. 30 bombers, possibly more. Each manned by trained crews, armed with multiple defensive guns. They were large, slow compared to fighters, but deadly in numbers. Carey's Blenheim was alone, vulnerable but precise. For a moment, nothing else existed. Only the cold wind, the roar of the engines, and the formation ahead. Carey's mind switched into trained focus. Attack vectors, angles, potential escape routes, cloud cover, relative speed. He knew every choice carried consequence. Hesitation could be fatal. The scramble had brought him here. It had launched him into a sky where the odds were overwhelming, where every second mattered, where every movement could mean survival or death. Carey's hands tightened on the controls. He leveled the aircraft, ready to make the first calculated pass. The enemy formation had yet to react. The Blenheim's guns were ready. The gray morning held its breath. Carey's eyes scanned the distant horizon, waiting for movement, waiting for confirmation. The radar had warned them, 30 bombers heading toward the Scottish coast. But until you saw them with your own eyes, it was impossible to feel the scale of what was coming. Carey's heart pounded, not with fear but with focused anticipation. Then, faint shapes emerged from the clouds, growing larger with every second. Crosses on their wings, long fuselages, and the disciplined formation that spoke of years of training and confidence. 30 Heinkel He-111s, each a machine built for destruction, each crewed by men who had already seen combat in Poland. They were not fast, but they were methodical, deadly, and unyielding. Carey's Blenheim was alone. Behind him, the observer and wireless operator shared a tense glance. Words were unnecessary. Training, instinct, and hours of preparation had taught them to move as one. Carey's eyes flicked between instruments and the formation ahead, plotting an attack, calculating the angles, the altitudes, the timing. Every second counted. The Heinkels did not see him yet. From below, the gray tarmac of RAF Wick was invisible, hidden by clouds and distance. From above, the pilots believed their mission would be routine. Approach the target, maintain formation, and release bombs with precision. Carey's presence was not expected. That was the advantage he held, one small, fragile advantage against overwhelming numbers. He climbed higher, using the mist and early sunlight to obscure his approach. The Blenheim was not fast, but in the hands of an experienced pilot, it could maneuver unpredictably. Carey's training told him, don't fight them head-on. Hit angles that force reaction, make them worry, make them hesitate. He adjusted his course. The first pass would be a distraction, a probe to see how the formation reacted. Careful now, expose too much, and the guns on those bombers would find their mark in seconds. Too cautious, and the formation would pass untouched. Timing, speed, precision. Carey's mind ran through it like clockwork. As he approached, the formation came into clearer view. Engines hummed, propellers slicing the cold air. Crews in the bombers checked instruments, focused on their approach. Carey's forward gun was ready. The observer's dorsal turret was locked, scanning for opportunity. It was almost like a chessboard, with lives as the stakes. Carey dove slightly, using the cloud layer as cover, and closed the distance. At first the bombers seemed like a wall, large, slow, unyielding. Then he began to see gaps. The blind spots beneath the tail, the space above the cockpit where the defensive guns could not reach. He adjusted his trajectory, bringing the Blenheim into the first firing window. Short bursts of fire, aimed not to destroy but to force movement. Engines flared and crewmen jerked in surprise at the tracer rounds cutting through the air. The formation wavered. Pilots had trained for attack, but not like this. Not from angles so sudden, so unorthodox. Carey's Blenheim slid through the sky like a hornet, attacking unpredictably. Every maneuver, every burst of fire forced a reaction. The Heinkels began to adjust course, trying to maintain formation. The tight geometry that had made them efficient now became a liability as they avoided imagined threats. Carey pulled up sharply, diving and weaving. The wind roared in his ears, instruments rattling. Bullets missed by inches, hitting the fabric skin of the Blenheim, leaving tiny holes. Each near miss was a reminder of vulnerability, but Carey's training kept him calm, focused. The only thought: keep moving, keep forcing the formation to react. The second pass was more aggressive. Carey targeted the center of the formation, forcing bombers to turn slightly, disrupting their alignment. The observer fired sporadically, adding pressure, creating the illusion of multiple attackers. The Blenheim's speed was marginal, but its unpredictability became its weapon. The enemy formation broke slightly, as crews responded not just to the aircraft, but to fear, to uncertainty. Below, the Scottish coastline remained distant, unaware of the drama unfolding above. Carey knew that even a few minutes of disruption could change the outcome on the ground. He calculated the timing, altitude, and angle of the next dive, ensuring he did not overcommit. Fuel and ammunition were finite. Mistakes were fatal. Another dive, closer this time. The guns fired, tracer lines cutting through the morning mist. The formation wobbled, gaps appearing between bombers. Some crews attempted to regroup, but Carey was already planning the next maneuver. Up, down, left, right, each move forcing German pilots to readjust, exposing blind spots, creating chaos. The Blenheim became a ghost, striking where least expected, vanishing before return fire could focus. The German crews realized something was wrong. One, then another, tried to identify how many attackers were present, but Carey's movements were deceptive. Forward and dorsal guns created confusion. Some bombers even began evasive action, turning slightly off course. Carey observed each reaction, calculating which gaps could be exploited next. Each small adjustment eroded the mission's cohesion. Time passed in seconds, though it felt like hours. Fuel burned faster than normal, the engine straining against the weight of aggressive maneuvers. Ammunition dwindled. Carey's mind remained focused, calculating each pass. Maximum disruption with minimum exposure. The Blenheim had no armor, no superior guns, no chance in a head-on fight. Its advantage was entirely in timing, movement, and psychological pressure. Finally, Carey made the last aggressive maneuver. A low pass beneath the bombers, engines screaming, guns ready. The formation's alignment broke entirely. Apart, some turning back, others dropping altitude prematurely. The mission was failing, not because of massive firepower, but because one man had forced hesitation, confusion, and fear. The skill of the pilot transformed an obsolete aircraft into an instrument of disruption. The Blenheim's guns clicked empty, ammunition exhausted. Carey's fuel warning blinked red. He could not continue indefinitely. But the damage was done. The formation had scattered, cohesion lost, mission timing disrupted. Carey pulled up, climbing back into clouds for concealment. The attack had ended, not in destruction of all bombers, but in complete failure of their intended objective. Below, British defenses prepared for the stragglers, easier targets thanks to Carey's work. The enemy's confidence was shaken. The first real test of RAF response in this sector had been a success, not through superior numbers, but through skill, determination, and timing. Carey leveled the Blenheim, engine screaming, adrenaline still high. He glanced at his observer and wireless operator. Both were pale but focused, alive and functional. The aircraft, scarred by near misses, had held together. The mission had succeeded against all odds. The sky above RAF Wick, once gray and empty, now held the memory of a single Blenheim weaving through 30 bombers. The enemy had felt its presence, even if they could not see it clearly. Carey's first contact with the enemy, executed with precision and calm under pressure, became the measure by which every RAF pilot would understand courage, calculation, and the thin line between life and death in the air. From a distance, it looked impossible. 30 German bombers moved in tight formation, steady and disciplined, engines humming in unison. Each aircraft carried multiple machine guns, overlapping fields of fire, trained crews who knew exactly where to aim. They flew like a wall, slow but deadly. Against them stood one Blenheim, outdated, underarmed, unarmored. Any textbook would have called it suicide. Carey did not think in textbooks. He circled above the formation, hidden briefly by cloud. His eyes traced their movement, counting aircraft, measuring spacing, watching how they held formation. He knew that the strength of bomber formations was also their weakness. Discipline could turn into hesitation. Order could turn into confusion. He spoke calmly to his crew, short words, clear instructions, no speeches, no drama. They understood what was about to happen and no one objected. In the air, decisions were already made before words were spoken. Carey pushed the nose down. The Blenheim began to dive, engines screaming as cold air rushed over the wings. Speed built quickly. The aircraft shook slightly, warning him not to push too hard. Carey held it just below the limit. Too much and the wings could fail. Too little and he would be caught in defensive fire. This was the narrow line he flew on. The German crews noticed movement. At first, it was only one observer who spotted the shape dropping from the clouds. He shouted a warning. Gun turrets began to move. Tracers flashed through the air, bright lines cutting across the gray sky. Carey felt the aircraft shudder as bullets passed close, some striking fabric and metal. He did not pull away. Instead, he aimed directly at the center of the formation. This was the impossible part. Bomber crews were trained to expect fighters attacking from the sides or rear. Head-on attacks were rare, dangerous, and usually fatal. But Carey knew something they did not. For a few critical seconds, their guns could not all focus at once. Their training demanded coordination, and coordination took time. Carey stole that time. The Blenheim surged forward, straight into the teeth of the formation. The observer fired short, controlled bursts, not spraying wildly, but aiming at cockpits, engines, anything that forced reaction. Tracer fire lit the sky. German gunners panicked, firing too early, too late, overcorrecting. The formation began to ripple. One bomber edged left. Another drifted right. Small movements, but enough to break perfect alignment. Carey flew through the gap, so close he could see faces through cockpit glass. Fear, shock, disbelief. No one expected a Blenheim to be there. He pulled up sharply, climbing hard. The aircraft protested, engines straining, but it responded. Bullets chased him upward, tearing through air where he had been seconds earlier. Carey rolled into cloud, disappearing just long enough to reset the fight. The German crews tried to reform. They believed this was a lone attacker. One aircraft. One problem, but Carey did not allow them to settle. He came again, this time from below and behind, exploiting blind spots he knew well. The Blenheim was not faster, but it was unpredictable. Carey changed angles constantly, refusing to give the gunners a stable target. Another pass, more confusion. A bomber broke formation entirely, its pilot trying to avoid collision. That movement forced others to adjust. The one solid wall of aircraft became uneven, vulnerable. Carey was not trying to destroy them all. He was trying to unbalance them, and it worked. The Germans now believed they were under attack by multiple fighters. Radio calls overlapped, orders conflicted. Some crews wanted to press on, others wanted to turn back. Formation leaders struggled to regain control, but Carey kept the pressure constant. He attacked from above, then below, then straight through again. Each time felt like rolling dice with death. Bullets tore past the cockpit. The smell of cordite filled the air. The Blenheim took hits, small but dangerous. Any one of them could cut a control cable, puncture a fuel line, or wound a crewman. Carey did not slow. He knew the longer he stayed, the worse his odds became. Fuel was dropping fast. Ammunition was running low, but the effect was undeniable. The bomber formation was no longer confident. It was reactive, hesitant, uncertain. That hesitation was everything. One bomber released its bombs early, the crew panicking. Others followed, dropping payloads into the sea, lightening their aircraft to escape faster. The mission was collapsing. What had been a precise strike was now a scattered retreat. Carey made one final pass. He dove across the front of the formation, guns firing until they clicked empty. Tracers flashed, then stopped. Silence followed, broken only by the roar of engines and the rattle of loose panels. Carey pulled away, climbing into cloud one last time. He did not chase them. There was no need. The impossible attack had already succeeded. Below, the coastline was safe. The bombers turned away, their formation broken, their confidence shattered. A single Blenheim had done what logic said could not be done, not by destroying 30 bombers but by defeating their purpose. Carey checked his instruments. Fuel critical, ammunition gone. The aircraft was wounded but flyable. He set course for home, every sense still sharp. As the Blenheim limped back toward RAF Wick, the sky felt strangely empty. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by exhaustion and realization. Carey did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply flew. On the ground, no one would believe the full story at first. One aircraft, one pilot, 30 bombers turned back. It sounded like exaggeration, like propaganda. But the evidence was there, in radar plots, in dropped bombs at sea, in shaken enemy reports. The impossible attack was real, not because the Blenheim was powerful, not because Carey was fearless, but because experience, timing, and decision turned a hopeless situation into victory. And that is what made it impossible. Not that it was done, but that anyone dared to try. Carey's heart was still racing, but reality sank in fast. The Blenheim had survived the impossible attack, but it was not unscathed. Every switch, every gauge screamed warnings. His forward gun had emptied its last rounds. The dorsal turret was exhausted. Tracer fire still glowed faintly in the sky behind him, like burned threads marking every near miss. He glanced at the fuel gauge, almost empty. Red telltales blinked, a universal language of danger. One more aggressive maneuver, one more climb, and the engines would sputter, leaving him to fall into the cold North Sea. Every second in the air had burned more fuel than usual. Every evasive twist and dive had pushed the Blenheim beyond its limits. "Fuel's critical," he said to the observer, keeping his voice calm. It was not panic. There was no room for panic, but the truth was undeniable. They could not stay long. They had fought impossible odds, and now the aircraft that had carried them through danger threatened to betray them. The observer nodded, scanning the horizon for threats. The sky seemed quieter now, but the enemy had not completely gone. Stragglers might still be circling, but the Blenheim could not take another fight. Carey weighed his options quickly. Turn for home or continue pressing the scattered formation. Every choice had risk. The difference between a safe landing and a watery grave was measured in minutes. Carey chose survival, but not without one final calculated risk. He had to push the aircraft home while keeping enough altitude and speed to avoid. The airframe creaked under the stress. Fabric wings fluttered in places where bullets had nicked them. The engine throbbed in protest. Carey adjusted throttle and mixture carefully, coaxing every last drop of performance without demanding a breakdown. The Blenheim had already earned its nickname, the flying Coffin, and he was determined it would not live up to it today. Bullets had pierced panels and gun ports. The smell of burned metal mixed with oil and cordite lingered in the cockpit. Carey ignored it, focusing on the horizon, on the distant patch of gray that marked home. Each second felt stretched, each breath measured. The adrenaline that had carried him through attacks now gave way to fatigue and tense concentration. The observer called out small details, altitude, heading, minor threats. Carey listened, replying only when necessary. Communication had to be precise, minimal. No distraction could be afforded. Every action now directly affected the chance to survive. He imagined the squadron back at Wick. Engines running, fuel trucks ready, mechanics prepared. One thought kept him steady: they would survive this. They had to. But only if nothing else went wrong. One mistake now, one miscalculation, and the hours of daring maneuvering would be worthless. A warning bell rang. The engine temperature was climbing dangerously. Carey leaned into the controls, adjusting propeller pitch and throttle to balance power and preservation. It was a delicate dance. Maintain speed to reach home, maintain altitude to avoid vulnerability, all while the fuel gauge ticked toward emptiness. Every knot of airspeed, every slight adjustment mattered. The dorsal turret operator checked his instruments. Ammunition was empty. Carey's forward gun silent. They had nothing left to fight with if another bomber or fighter appeared. Their only weapon now was their skill, precision flying, evasive maneuvers, calculation, and luck. Luck had been a quiet partner all morning, and they would need it again. The sea below was gray and merciless. Carey forced himself to think clearly. Altitude allowed visibility, but higher fuel consumption. Lower would conserve fuel but risk exposure. The Blenheim's light frame and fabric-covered wings offered little protection. He chose the middle path, trusting skill to compensate for weakness. The wind howled past, whipping instruments and straps. The Blenheim vibrated under strain. Carey adjusted each control subtly, avoiding aggressive turns unless absolutely necessary. This was a battle of survival now, not aggression. The impossible attack had ended, but its consequences demanded the same concentration as combat. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Every mile closer to RAF Wick felt simultaneously near and far. Carey checked the fuel gauge repeatedly. Empty. Nothing left but momentum, altitude, and hope. The aircraft creaked, groaned, but held. For the first time, he allowed himself a fleeting recognition. They passed over open water. The North Sea looked endless, unforgiving. One wrong maneuver and the Blenheim would not touch land again. Carey's thoughts went to simple things: speed, heading, altitude, nothing else. He could not afford distraction, fear, or hesitation. Finally, after what seemed an eternity but was measured in minutes, the coastline came into view. The frozen, gray expanse of RAF Wick appeared, faint but unmistakable. Carey guided the Blenheim toward the runway, every adjustment deliberate, every turn careful. Ground crews were already alert, watching the sky, expecting anything. They did not know yet what had happened above. The landing approach was tense. The Blenheim's fuel was dangerously low, engines strained to limits, guns empty, aircraft battered. Carey flared gently, coaxing the wheels onto the frozen runway. A shudder, a squeak of tires, and the aircraft was down. On the tarmac, reality finally sank in. They had survived. Ground crews rushed forward, checking instruments, fuel, and structural damage. Carey climbed out, unshaken outwardly, though exhaustion tugged at every muscle. The observer followed, pale-faced but alive. The Blenheim, once called a coffin, had been a fragile lifeline, a vessel of death and survival intertwined. The mission had ended. The impossible attack succeeded. But Carey's survival, and that of his crew, owed as much to calculation and control in the fuel and ammo crisis as to skill and courage in the fight itself. The aircraft had carried them this far, but it was human judgment that had ensured the final outcome. The crisis was over, but its lesson remained. Even in the skies where death was expected, discipline, calculation, and calm under pressure could preserve life against impossible odds. The sky was deceptively calm now, gray stretching endlessly above the North Sea. Carey could feel every heartbeat, every vibration of the Blenheim under him. The impossible attack had scattered the German bombers, but the danger was far from over. Fuel was near empty, ammunition was gone, the aircraft was battered. Every moment of hesitation could mean disaster. Carey made the decision without hesitation. It was time to disengage. Survival required focus, precision, and discipline. No heroics now. The enemy formation was broken, their intent thwarted, but the sea below remained cold, unforgiving, and ready to claim the unwary. He signaled to his observer and wireless operator. Each nodded. Actions had to be deliberate, coordinated, perfect. The Blenheim was fragile, its frame stretched past limits by the morning's maneuvers. Carey had to treat it with respect, coaxing every ounce of performance without demanding the impossible. One sudden roll, one aggressive climb, and the aircraft could fail. That was a risk he could not take. Carey adjusted throttle and mixture carefully, listening to the engine's protests. They would carry him home if treated gently. The observer scanned the horizon, eyes sharp for stragglers. Any German aircraft that remained in the area could strike without warning. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. Silence, except for the roar of the engines and the rush of wind. The coastline came into view, a gray strip against the darker North Sea. RAF Wick loomed closer with each passing second, small but infinitely important. Carey calculated his course, factoring wind, altitude, and remaining fuel. Every movement had to conserve energy while maintaining enough speed to avoid the risk of being caught by a returning enemy fighter. There was no margin for error. As they approached, Carey maintained a steady climb, avoiding sudden maneuvers. He could almost feel the wing's fabric quiver beneath him, small tears from bullet holes stretching with each gust. The Blenheim was fragile, its reputation as a flying coffin earned many times over, yet it carried them still, holding together through skill, patience, and a touch of luck. Below, the sea reflected the gray sky. Carey's mind flicked briefly to the North Sea, the water cold, vast, unforgiving. A moment of distraction, a misjudged landing, and the Blenheim would be claimed. He pushed the thought aside. Focus. Calculation. Every decision from this point would decide life or death. The wireless crackled. Ground crews called updates on wind conditions, runway status, and incoming traffic. Carey acknowledged, keeping communication short and precise. Time was precious. The Blenheim's engines were crying for mercy. Fuel was dangerously low. Ammunition was non-existent. Every second in the air was a second closer to failure. Carey lined up with the runway. The familiar sight of Wick was a small comfort, a target to aim for amidst exhaustion and lingering tension. The approach had to be flawless. Any misjudgment could tear apart the aircraft or send it sliding across ice and frost. Careful. Steady, controlled. Precision was survival now. The final descent began. Carey adjusted flaps, eased the throttle, and maintained a perfect glide path. The ground crew's eyes were fixed upward, waiting for the battered aircraft that had returned from the impossible mission. They saw the Blenheim descend with a grace that belied its battered state, and for the first time since the morning began, a collective exhale swept through the airfield. The wheels touched the frozen runway with a soft shudder, the landing smooth but tense. Carey eased the throttle to idle, letting the aircraft roll to a stop. Silence fell, broken only by the hum of engines winding down and the distant wind across the tarmac. The impossible attack. Ground crews rushed forward, assessing fuel, structure, and the fragile wings. The observer and wireless operator climbed out, faces pale but alive. Carey followed, methodical and calm outwardly, though the exhaustion of the morning weighed heavily on his body. Every man had survived against impossible odds. Every instrument, every control, every calculation had mattered. Debriefing would come later. For now, the Blenheim sat on the tarmac, a battered survivor of the skies. The enemy formation had been thwarted. Fuel had run dangerously low. Ammunition was spent. But through discipline, calculation, and skill, Carey had brought the aircraft and his crew home. The flight had been a narrow margin between life and death, and they had survived. RAF Wick absorbed the details slowly. Mechanics inspected the aircraft. Pilots whispered, admiration and disbelief mingling. Carey remained calm, understated. He had done his duty, no more, no less. But the mission had proven something fundamental. Even when the aircraft is inadequate, even when the odds are impossibly against you, skill, discipline, and focus can bring survival. The Blenheim would fly again, but never quite the same. It carried scars, memories, and the evidence of courage under fire. Carey and his crew had faced impossible odds, disengaged with precision, and returned. And though newspapers, rumors, and later histories would call it legend, the men who lived it knew. It was the careful attention to fuel, ammunition, and control, the simple, necessary details, that made the impossible attack survivable. As night fell over Wick, Carey sat quietly, listening to engines idle, crew moving about the airfield, the wind slicing across the frozen landscape. The day had been long, exhausting, impossible, yet survival had been claimed. Lives preserved, lessons learned, and the Blenheim, the so-called flying Coffin, rested, fragile but victorious, a testament to human skill and determination in the face of mechanical limitations. The mission had ended. Disengage, return. Survival. The impossible had been attempted, and lived to tell the story. The frozen tarmac of RAF Wick was quiet now, except for the muted hum of cooling engines and the occasional murmur of ground crew. Carey climbed down from the cockpit, hands steady, face calm. But inside, the adrenaline of the impossible mission still coursed through his veins. Every inch of the Blenheim bore the story of the morning. The holes from German fire, the worn fabric wings, the fatigue etched into the machine. What they had survived was almost unimaginable, and now came the moment of reckoning, confirmation and aftermath. The observer and wireless operator emerged, pale but alive. Their eyes met Carey's, and in that brief exchange no words were needed. They had seen death in the air and walked away. The Blenheim, that fragile, fabric-covered fighter, ground crews approached, their hands already reaching for instruments and gauges, checking fuel levels, structural integrity, and the guns that had long since emptied. Carey walked among them, methodical and composed, explaining calmly what had happened. He recounted the flight, the attacks, the enemy formation, the maneuvers, but he did not embellish. To him, it was duty performed. Yet each detail, every factual recounting, was astonishing to the men listening. 30 German bombers had been scattered by a single pilot in an aircraft that his own service had dubbed a Coffin. The very thought was almost too much to grasp. Intelligence officers soon arrived, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and curiosity. Carey filed his report, each word deliberate, precise, unemotional. Contact with enemy formation. Engaged multiple targets. Formation dispersed. Request rearming and refueling for next sortie. No grandiose claims, no exaggeration, no emotional flourish. Yet behind the understated language lay an achievement that would ripple across RAF Fighter Command. The observers and radar operators confirmed the sighting. German radio intercepts later revealed the confusion and disarray among the Luftwaffe crews. Carey's actions had not only disrupted their mission but shaken their confidence. The debriefing lasted hours. Officers asked for numbers, positions, tactics, and fuel consumption. Carey answered methodically, emphasizing accuracy over dramatics. Every detail mattered, but there was no need to embellish. The facts spoke louder than words. The scale of the engagement, the audacity of the attack, and the skill required to survive became undeniable once every report, observation, and confirmation was collected. Carey had done more than survive. He had achieved a tactical victory against impossible odds. Word began to spread slowly through the base. Pilots and crews whispered in mess halls and hangars, repeating fragments of the story. The Blenheim had faced 30 bombers and returned. The courage, skill, and determination required were extraordinary. Even officers accustomed to danger paused to consider the scale of the achievement. It was a story that had to be confirmed, checked, measured, but each verification only strengthened the truth. RAF Fighter Command recognized the significance immediately. Carey's engagement was more than a personal feat. It was a demonstration of what skill, initiative, and audacity could achieve even with inadequate equipment. Tactical doctrines were reviewed. Pilots were encouraged to employ aggressive, calculated tactics, to trust their judgment in the air. The lesson was clear. The aircraft might be flawed, the numbers might be against them, but human initiative could turn weakness into advantage. Carey's actions had become a new standard, a model for engagement when facing superior enemy forces. The aftermath extended beyond the base. Propaganda and morale benefited quietly. For the men and women who followed the war from home, stories of British pilots defying overwhelming odds inspired hope. Newspapers later recounted the daring of a single pilot who had disrupted 30 bombers, though often without naming Carey specifically, for security reasons. The message was universal. Britain could fight, Britain could resist, and courage mattered more than calculations and equipment alone. Carey himself remained modest, consistently downplaying the event. In interviews years later, he emphasized that he had done what any competent RAF pilot would have done under the circumstances. He saw the mission not as heroic, but as duty performed in an extraordinary situation. That humility became part of the legend, illustrating the understated professionalism of the Blenheim. Meanwhile, bore silent witness to the engagement. Mechanics and engineers recorded every bullet hole, every stress mark, every mechanical strain. The aircraft would continue flying, but its legacy had already been cemented. Where design failed, human skill prevailed. Where odds were impossible, determination overcame. The flying Coffin had proved itself capable in the hands of a master, transforming from symbol of vulnerability into icon of defiance. In the days that followed, Carey continued flying missions, but the January engagement remained singular. Pilots referenced it in planning sessions, using it as an example of audacity and precision. The term "pull a Carey" quietly entered squadron slang, symbolizing an attack executed with daring when the odds seemed insurmountable. Even superior aircraft, when flown without initiative, could fail. Conversely, a fragile machine with skilled hands could achieve the impossible. The psychological effect on both sides of the conflict was notable. RAF morale strengthened. Pilots understood that courage and skill mattered even more than numbers and technical specifications. Luftwaffe intelligence, when later analyzed, acknowledged the confusion Carey had sown, the disruption caused to operational plans. A single individual, in a seemingly inadequate aircraft, had altered tactical outcomes in a way that echoed beyond the immediate battle. Historians later noted that the engagement highlighted contrasts in military doctrine. German crews had relied on rigid formations and overwhelming numbers, assuming that standardized procedures would ensure success. Carey's improvisation demonstrated that initiative and adaptability could disrupt even the most disciplined operations. The battle became a lesson in the value of human judgment, the limitations of relying solely on equipment, and the unpredictable variables that could define war. Carey's actions that January morning endured as a symbol of resilience, skill, and determination. The confirmation of his achievement, the debriefing, reports, eyewitness accounts, ensured that the story would not fade. The aftermath reinforced the importance of morale, initiative, and the human element in combat. In the archives, in the memories of those who flew with him, and in the legacy of the Blenheim itself, the event remained vivid. One pilot, one fragile aircraft, 30 bombers, and a demonstration that determination, skill, and courage could indeed overcome impossible odds. By the time the next winter arrived, The legend had already begun to ripple through RAF squadrons. Carey continued his service, blending routine missions with extraordinary acts when necessary, but the impact of that morning's engagement resonated far beyond the cockpit of a single aircraft. It served as a reminder. In war, equipment and numbers matter, but initiative, courage, and precise judgment can transform the impossible into reality. The North Sea had long since returned to its quiet, cold gray after that January morning. Yet in the hearts and minds of those who witnessed it, the events of that day refused to fade. Carey's engagement with 30 German bombers had become more than a military anecdote. It had grown into a symbol, a story of courage, skill, and human determination that transcended statistics, machinery, and strategy. RAF Wick, the frozen airfield that had watched the Blenheim disappear into the gray skies and return battered but triumphant, preserved memories in small ways. Mechanics recalled the trembling fabric wings, the bullet holes pocked into the fuselage, the exhausted crew stepping out with calm professionalism. Pilots shared whispered tales of the lone fighter that defied odds. The phrase, "pull a Carey," began to circulate quietly, a shorthand for audacity in the air, an example of what one pilot could achieve against impossible odds. As months passed, the story spread. Squadron after squadron heard of the daring attack, the scattered bombers, the exhausted but victorious Blenheim. New pilots, inexperienced and nervous, were shown the engagement as a lesson in initiative and courage. Carey's name, once obscure outside his immediate circle, became known across fighter command. The engagement of that frozen morning served as a benchmark, a touchstone of what was possible when training, skill, and bravery were applied in perfect measure. Museums years later preserved the physical artifacts of the Blenheim's history. Children walked past reconstructed aircraft, their engines silent, their fabric wings taut under careful conservation. The placards described specifications, speed, armament, but some veterans lingered, sharing the true story. They spoke of Carey, of the morning he faced overwhelming odds and returned, of the courage that allowed a fragile machine to become a weapon of legend. The aircraft itself became inseparable from the narrative of human determination, triumphing over mechanical inadequacy. Historians and military analysts studied the engagement as well. It offered insights into aerial combat, human psychology, and tactical doctrine. Carey's actions demonstrated that individual initiative could disrupt even the most disciplined enemy formations. That lesson would influence training, strategy, and morale, showing that even in war, the human element could defy statistical expectation and alter the course of operations. One man in a fragile aircraft had proven that audacity and skill could turn weakness into advantage. The psychological impact endured on both sides. RAF pilots found renewed confidence, knowing that courage mattered more than sheer numbers. Luftwaffe crews, when later reviewing the reports, realized that technical superiority could be countered by human ingenuity and daring. The engagement introduced an element of unpredictability, a factor that rigid doctrines could not easily account for. The story became part of the broader narrative of the Battle of Britain and early Second World War air campaigns, a reminder that machines alone do not win wars, people do. Carey himself continued to serve, his demeanor unchanged. He avoided fanfare, focusing instead on duty, training, and the next mission. For him, the engagement was a professional responsibility fulfilled under extraordinary circumstances. Yet the world around him recognized the magnitude of his actions. Awards, mentions, and the respect of peers followed, though he accepted them with the same calm modesty he had shown throughout. The legend, after all, was not built by a single man seeking glory. It grew organically from an act of courage that inspired others. Time passed, the war advanced, and the Bristol Blenheim eventually left frontline service. Newer aircraft replaced it, Spitfires, Hurricanes, and more advanced fighters that could match or surpass enemy technology. Yet the story of the Blenheim that morning remained. It was no longer simply an aircraft. It was a symbol, a lesson, and a legend. It represented the capacity of human skill to transcend the limitations of material tools. It illustrated the power of initiative, bravery, and focus when faced with overwhelming odds. Veterans who had flown with Carey or who had followed his story shared it repeatedly. Stories became lessons in training, inspiration in moments of fear, and reminders of the resilience inherent in determined individuals. The engagement over the North Sea was preserved in logs, archives, and oral histories, becoming a part of RAF mythology. Future generations would look back and understand that wars are not solely won by machines or numbers, but by people willing to act decisively when it matters most. Even decades later, as historians, veterans, and museum visitors reflected on the story, its core message remained clear. One man, one inadequate aircraft, 30 enemy bombers, and an unshakable resolve had changed perceptions, inspired courage, and demonstrated that skill, determination, and bravery could achieve the extraordinary. Carey's legacy endured not because of technical achievement alone, but because of what it revealed about human potential when faced with impossible challenges. And so, the legend endures. The cold January skies may have faded into history, the aircraft may have become a museum piece, and the war may have moved onward. But the story of Squadron Leader Carey, the Blenheim, and the impossible morning over the North Sea continues to inspire. It remains a testament to courage, initiative, and the enduring truth that when individuals refuse to accept the impossible, they can achieve the extraordinary. The Blenheim they once called a coffin became, in that frozen January morning, a symbol of defiance, skill, and the human spirit's capacity to turn weakness into triumph. Carey's choice, the aircraft's flight, and the scattered German bombers over the gray North Sea would live forever, not just in reports, museums, or history books,